and give you just a brief background of Startup Grind in case you've never been to a Startup Grind event. If you haven't, shame on you. But if you have, you're okay. So Startup Grind started a little over 10 years ago out of the Valley in Silicon Valley. We now have well over 600 chapters around the world. Arguably, the largest startup community in the world is kind of powered by Startup Grind. Here in Seattle, we started about 9 years ago, and we do obviously monthly events similar to this, and in person in the good old days pre-COVID, we did those every single month. So Startup Grind is all about connecting entrepreneurs, educating entrepreneurs, and just inspiring entrepreneurs to build companies. That's what it's all about. That's all we really care about at Startup Grind, is helping entrepreneurs build and grow great companies. Today we are super lucky to have some wonderful people, to go through a great book that I actually came across several months ago. It's we have the author here, Suneel, and Paweł is going to do a little interview, and so we'll go through that. But first, I'd like to thank the sponsors, because we wouldn't be here without all of our sponsors worldwide. And AWS is our sponsor today. And Madeline, if you can hit that button, awesome. Thank you.
There's a reason why for the last 13 years, startups overwhelmingly prefer to build on top of AWS. We have the largest number of services, making it easy for you to take on some of the biggest challenges with the smallest teams. We also have partnerships with the top VCs, accelerators, and incubators around the world, making it easier to secure your next round of funding.
I'm a solution architect with the AWS Xstart program. What we do is we work with startups in the education sector, and we help them build their services on AWS.
So We Power Tech is AWS's diversity and inclusion outreach program. The program is really twofold. One is to increase the number of underrepresented technologists within the industry, and the second is to provide a platform for them to be seen and heard.
If you're wondering how the AWS evangelism team might be able to help your startup, there are many ways. We're technically credible across our entire catalog of products, so we can help you figure out which services might be able to meaningfully impact your business. We also want to help tell your story. So if you're building something cool, we want to know about it and help spread that message to the world. So you might end up on stage at an event like AWS Summit. If you're a startup, you should also definitely check out the AWS Lofts. These are event spaces that are free to anyone with an AWS account. You can treat them like co-working spaces, but the awesome thing about them is that we also have people like technical evangelists like myself, solutions architects that come and give hands-on technical workshops and sessions to help you learn how to more effectively utilize the AWS products and platforms that you're already building on top of.
We are a dedicated team of people that love startups, that we just want to come and help you with whatever we can, whether it be technical or business focused. We are here to help guide you and make sure that you do have a say in what's going on. We do get your feedback. We do bring that feedback to the service teams. That is what we're here for.
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, AWS, for continuing to support. We love you guys. Thanks for all the help you do in the startup community. Today we're doing a couple things. We're introducing Cassandra Schwartz, who's taking over the reins at the Seattle chapter of Startup Grind. Cassandra, thank you very much for joining us and taking the torch and continuing the movement for Startup Grind in Seattle. Super appreciate it. She's a Moz that just got acquired, works for Moz, and is a longtime event person. So and deeply involved in the startup community. So Cassandra, thanks again. She'll be running the Q&A towards the end. So hold your questions to the end. You can throw them in the chat. Cassandra will be managing that, but we're going to try to get to the end and answer those questions all at the same time. So when you have questions, just throw them in the chat, and Cassandra will help manage that. So Cassandra, you want to just say a couple words, and then we'll move on.
I am just thankful. I'm glad to be here. I've got big shoes to fill in Mike's absence, but I am excited to continue the Seattle chapter and looking forward to today's event.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks again. So hey, we're again super excited to have Suneel Gupta, who's the author of Backable. Backable actually was number one new release on Amazon, and it is actually a great book. So if you are have a startup and looking to figure out how to, get funding, et cetera, Backable is an awesome book. He's actually teaches innovation at Harvard and is an entrepreneur in residence, EIR at Kleiner Perkins. He's backed some, great startups himself, Airbnb, 23andMe, who just took their IPO. I'm sure you probably did well there, Suneel. And then we have Tooploox founder, Paweł Solyga. He's going to be doing the interview, and his company helps innovative companies and startups build digital products by applying AI, mobile, and web technologies. And again, thank you guys for being here and taking some time out of your day, number one. But two, just all the work you guys have done and to help move startups forward. So I'll let you guys take it from here. Thank everyone for being here, and knock yourselves out, guys.
Thanks, Mike.
No worries.
Hey, Suneel. It's really great to have you here today.
Yeah.
And reconnect for this chat. I really remember I think it was back in 2014 when we were both getting off the ground, two entrepreneurs trying to build their companies. Tooploox was still very tiny, and I was an iOS engineer actually working closely with you and your team, and Rise was validating its nutrition coaching app business model. So it was a good time.
Yeah, and it's funny because when Mike was talking about community and how important that is, first of all, it's just awesome to see a community that can come together from all different parts of the world and still feel connected. I think it's one of the pieces of silver lining that we got out of the pandemic was like how possible that could really be. And it made me think of you and your team. You guys were, as everybody who's on this webinar knows, running a business can be a very lonely journey sometimes, and community becomes very, very important. And that includes, friends, family, but also the people that you work with too. And, Paweł, you and your team at Tooploox, you guys ended up being a part of truly a part of our community.
Thank you. I remember whenever I came to San Francisco, we would, chat about our businesses, but also, about our struggles and we face and all the opportunities in front of us, right? So, and fast forward to 2021, we're chatting about your book, Backable, and I remember reading it, and there was a lot of familiar stories stories you told me about over the years during our friendship. So I really appreciate that, and it was really actually never had that kind of experience reading a book. So thank you for that.
Sure.
And the book has 7 concepts in it. We won't be able to cover all of them. We will at least try to cover three of them during today's chat. But one of the stories you talk about at the beginning of the book is FailCon, and tell us more about it.
Yeah, so I get a call. This is pretty early in my entrepreneurial journey, and I had started a company called Rise, which was a one-on-one nutrition coaching service. You join the service, you get matched with a personal nutritionist, and you work with this person just over your mobile phone. And I'd say telehealth at that point in time was really just starting to kind of come into its own. I mean, obviously, especially over the past year and a half, telehealth has had a boom, but this is 2013, so pretty early in the life cycle of it all. And what we were doing is, in a lot of ways, you just take pictures of your food, and then you sync up any devices you had, so your Fitbit or whatever it was, and we would sort of pull that into a dashboard where you could end up having all of the information as a nutritionist to help steer somebody back on track. I got really passionate about the idea for lots of reasons, but I was not having much luck convincing investors to back this idea. And I had also started a couple of companies before this that had not done well. And so I kind of felt like in some ways, there's a term in Hollywood, it's called director's jail, where like if you create a couple of bad movies, it's very hard to get a movie funded. And I kind of felt like I was in that situation, but largely because the idea was still kind of new. This whole space was kind of new, and I didn't know how to convince people to take a chance on it. So I get a call from an organizer of a conference called FailCon, which stands for Failure Conference. And, it's always a humbling experience when someone calls you and says, hey, we're doing a conference on failure, and we would love for you to be the keynote speaker. And so I decided to do the speech, and I didn't know this at the time, but there was a reporter from the New York Times in the audience. And so fast forward to me sitting in my apartment. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and there's a full-length article on failure with my face as the cover of this article. And that article goes viral. So at the time, you literally could have Googled the word failure, and my face would have been one of your top search results. And so I'm trying to figure out, my instinct when something like that happens is to just kind of bury my head in the sand. I'm here trying to craft this. I think as many of us sometimes do, is we try to craft this sort of image of success. And now I have this fear that every time somebody even searches my name, the first thing you're going to see is an article profiling all of my failures. And a friend of mine reminded me of a story, and the story is it's a lesson that the Buddha had for his disciples. And the lesson was that whenever you feel pain in life, there are really two arrows that are shot. And the first arrow is the arrow that actually punctures your skin. And the second arrow is where you actually ascribe meaning to that pain. Now, you can't do anything about that first arrow, but you can do a lot with that second arrow. It's really kind of up to you to kind of figure out how to make meaning of these things that happen. And the way that I tried to do that was I started to use this article as an icebreaker for people who I was trying to meet. So I started emailing all these people that I admired, from Hollywood filmmakers to, venture capitalists, to leaders of iconic companies, to military leaders, and said in the email, like, clearly, as you can see from this article, I don't know what I'm doing, but would you be willing to grab some time with me and give me some advice? And the response rate to that email was just incredibly high, like way higher than I would have ever thought. They were willing to give me their time, and the conversations ended up being just these honest, open conversations where what I began to realize is that a lot of the people that we admire, when we see them, we are seeing the current day version of them. And it's very easy sometimes to assume that the current day version of somebody you admire is the way that they have always been. But the reality is that if you turn back the clock and you go back to the version 1, what you most often find is a very different version than the version you see today. And
the path to success, is filled with failure, right? That's how we learn. That's how we grow. And
Exactly.
So I think that the people that you reached out to, they value failure differently, right?
Exactly. And in a lot of ways, it was failure in how they actually grew, how they made these adjustments. What I was after was really, what were those adjustments? How do we as early entrepreneurs start to understand some of this, ahead of the curve? How do we learn from past failures? Like, I think somebody said this, I can't remember who said, success is a lousy teacher. So I didn't want to write a book about people's success. I wanted to write a book about where they messed up and what we could learn. And in particular, I was very interested in, how do you actually, we know that innovation, we know that coming up with great companies, great services is not just about coming up with the idea, right? It's also about getting other people excited about that. There are so many ideas out there that end up dying on the vine because they were good, but they just did not get anybody else on board. And I wanted to understand, like, what was the secret sauce to that? And that ultimately is what led me to writing this book.
So what is Backable?
Yeah, I mean, Backable is I think, the easiest way to describe it is this ability to, I think, inspire people in a way that moves them to action. And that last part is really key, moves them to action. You're at a cocktail party, or you're chatting with somebody and you share your idea with them. And there's a difference between, when they say, well, that's pretty cool, that's a cool idea, versus when they're like, my gosh, I need to connect you with so-and-so and so-and-so. This is brilliant. They get moved to action. And that's the key, right? And especially when it comes to people who invest in companies, they're listening to ideas all day, every day. But there's very, very few where they actually get inspired to take action, where they actually say, I need to loop in my colleagues. I need to loop in the people that I respect, because I think this is actually worth really, really digging into. And it doesn't just have to be with raising money either. I mean, a lot of people who are listening right now are leading teams, leading companies. How often do we go into meetings where we sort of discuss what it is that we want to do, but everybody sort of leaves? And yeah, there's some next steps because you told them that there are next steps. But there's a difference between sort of putting out like, here's what we think we're going to do, and other people feeling like, I want to go do this. I feel inspired to go do this. There's a big difference in that, and it ends up shaping cultures. So that's what I was after. How do we get people moved to action?
I feel like Backable can be applied whenever there are other people involved, right? It doesn't have to be raising money, but could be anything else, right? So moving on that, one of the chapters is called casting a central character, and you talk about how you switched the way you talk about Rise. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So the name of the chapter, Cast a Central Character. The reason this was an important one is because, when we think about sort of pitching anything, I think the idea of storytelling, I think has become very important. And you hear a lot about it. It's become in vogue. But I think storytelling can be misunderstood sometimes. It's not just about getting up in front of a room and saying, once upon a time, so-and-so happened, and then sort of, leaving the room or dropping the mic. Good storytelling is a combination of story and substance. And you kind of have to know how to marry both of those together. And what I found is that having a central character is a really good way of doing that. This is sort of a characterization of the one person that you are actually trying to serve. And I'll tell you, the person who really sort of brought this to my attention most clearly was Tim Ferriss. So I was pitching Tim on my idea. Again, Rise was one-on-one nutrition coaching, and he had just written The 4-Hour Body. And so I was like, this is going to be a perfect sort of person for this idea. And the way that I laid out my pitch, if you would have seen my deck, what you would have seen at that time was really 80% talking about the market, talking about the rising rates of obesity and hypertension and diabetes, and really almost talking about it in sort of a business school analysis type of way. And then at the very end of my presentation, almost as a footnote, I told the story of my father. And the story of my dad is that he was, when he was in his 40s, early 40s, he had a triple bypass surgery, emergency, was rushed to the hospital, rushed to the operating room. I was about 9 years old. And I remember going to the hospital and seeing him and feeling like, my gosh, he's aged like 20 years overnight. He looks like a completely different person. And I also remember on the ride home from the hospital, sitting in the back seat and flipping through the paperwork that they give you, because they give you a lot of discharge paperwork. And one of the pieces of paper was how to eat now, right? And it had things like eat broccoli, eat Brussels sprouts. And I remember thinking to myself, like,
What happened with that piece of paper?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we kept it on the kitchen counter for a little while, and then it just became ignored, right? Because we didn't eat broccoli, we didn't eat Brussels sprouts. Like, that wasn't really part of our diet, and we ate Indian food at home. And I remember thinking to myself, this is never going to work, and it didn't. My dad really struggled through it. Lucky for us, insurance kicked in and helped pay for the cost of a nutritionist. And it was that nutritionist who really sort of helped us customize things that were going to fit our lifestyle, that we were able to really get our act together. I believe that was the reason that my dad is still alive today, was because of the work that he did decades ago with this nutritionist. Now, I told Tim Ferriss this story, and his reaction to me is like, why did you say that story to the very end? Right? Like, you should tell that story first. Tell the story of this central character that you want to serve first. Then zoom out and talk about all the numbers. Talk about the millions and millions of people out there who are going through their own version of your father's story. And I guarantee you, this is going to end up being a much more compelling pitch. And the story that he told me is that when he wrote The 4-Hour Workweek, that was turned down by 26 publishers in a row. But a friend of his gave him a piece of advice: was, you're trying to write this book for millions of people. Why don't you rewrite it for one person? Pick one friend and write it for them, as if you're writing an email to them. And so he did. And it completely sharpened his narrative, his writing, his style, everything became sharper. And eventually, publishers ate it up, and it sold tens of millions of copies and did very, very well, but he wrote it for one person. So casting a central character and then talking about the market size, talking about the number of people out there who are going through their own version of that character story.
Got it. So it's easier to kind of identify with that one person and bring that central character into focus. That's what we should be doing with our pitches. And
Yeah.
that kind of reminds me of like just in general, storytelling and how we also work with companies and startups, and how important it is for those companies to tell their stories to us. Like, we are a software development company, so we have a lot of engineering talent on board too, right? So how do we actually get that talent excited? How do we get people excited? But when you're hiring your team too, like how do you get your team excited about your company, your startup, your idea, right? So I think it's very
you're bringing up a good point too, because casting a central character is important for pitches, but it's important to keep that going as well. Like one of the things that I found is if you looked at companies that tended to sort of fizzle out mission wise versus those that were able to sort of keep a sustainable mission, a lot of it that people just continued to be like genuinely excited about, a lot of it came down to just how prominent was that central character in the office space. Like if I was at Groupon early days, and our central character early days was very clear. It was a small business owner, right? We obsessed over the small business owner. Our walls were covered with stories of small business owners. But as we went public as a company, it became harder and harder to keep that focus on the small business owner. We started focusing on, what are our quarterly earnings going to look like? And it can be very easy to lose that sense of focus. Take the flip example though, another, on the other side, I've been visiting Airbnb's office since it was an infant startup in Potrero Hill to where it is today. And I continue to sort of check in. And the one thing that I see carried over from office space to office space is a storyboard of the host experience and a storyboard of the guest experience. And a storyboard is literally just a frame by frame of like, what does this person go through? It's like, it's drawn out pictures of what it is that they're actually experiencing. They keep that front and center. And whenever I'm in their office, I see people huddled around that storyboard to point to the parts of the experience that they really want to change or improve. I spoke to Kirsten Green for this book, who runs a venture capital firm named Forerunner Ventures. And she was also the first investor in Dollar Shave Club. And I asked her, like, were you interested from the get-go in Dollar Shave Club? And she said, absolutely not. I had zero interest in that business. She received the pitch deck, looked at it and said, this is not for me. And part of the reason for that is because she said razor blades are kind of a low margin product. And she just didn't feel it was going to fit e-commerce very well. But she ended up running into Michael Dubin at a party. It was a dinner party, and just randomly. And so Dubin goes over to her because he's in fundraising mode. And she's expecting him to say something like, hey, we're trying to revolutionize a multi-billion-dollar market through transformative technology, kind of give the standard Silicon Valley pitch. Instead, he said, look, let me take you into the eyes of my character, my central character. It's a 20-something-year-old male who is used to a certain level of convenience. He cares much more about his health than his father ever did. That includes what he puts in his body. It also includes what he puts on his body. But that convenience and that passion sort of falls out the door when he walks into a grocery store or a pharmacy, because now he's got to sort of go hunt for where the razor blades are. He's got to go find them in the aisle. He's got to locate them. Oftentimes he gets to that part and he realizes that it's literally behind a security case. So he's got to push a button. Now he's got to wait awkwardly in the aisle and wait for an annoyed worker to come over. By the way, everybody's kind of looking at you because they've made an announcement over the broadcast. And behind that case is not just razor blades, but it's things like condoms and laxatives, and no one knows what you're there to purchase. Then this annoyed worker shows up, unlocks the case, looks over your shoulder as you're making your purchase decision, and then you finally get to check out. He's like, that just doesn't fit where these customers are today. And it was walking Kirsten through this storyboard, through the eyes of his central character, that she said, you know what, I've got to be in this business. And she invested.
Yeah. Amazing story. Thank you. And then, yeah, I think that really brings us to, we've talked about storytelling, but maybe switch a little bit to how do we build engagement, listen, and talk about feedback.
Yeah.
You have the chapter called Flip Outsiders into Insiders, and would love to hear a little bit more about
Yeah,
that.
this is one of my favorite chapters, and it begins with a story that I love, which is that in the 1940s, Betty Crocker introduced instant cake mix to the market. And Betty Crocker thought instant cake mix was going to become like just a massive, massive hit. Oh, I see Tomas like commenting on my water bottle size. It might be the angle, Tomas, that I'm drinking the water bottle at. But Betty Crocker thought that it was going to be absolutely just a hit sensation product, because all you had to do, Tomas, is add water to the mix and like pop it in the oven, and voila, you get this really tasty treat. And so they were like, who wouldn't want this product? Everybody's going to want this product. So they were stunned when they found out that no one was buying instant cake mixes. It didn't sell well at all, despite this huge marketing push. And they couldn't figure out why. And so they hired this psychologist named Ernest Dykta to go out into the field and start interviewing customers. And what Dykta comes back with is, I think you have made the process of making a cake too easy, too simple. Because when the cake comes out of the oven, customers actually don't feel like it was really their cake. And so what Dykta recommends is, why don't you remove one ingredient, just one, and see what happens? And so they do. They remove the egg. And so now as a customer, you have to go out and buy a fresh egg, bring it home, crack it into the mix, stir it in, and now you can pop it in the oven. And sales completely take off. Completely take off. Instant cake mixes with now missing an egg are a huge, huge sensation. And, this idea has been unpacked over and over again. It was a group out of Harvard that, a few years ago called this the IKEA effect, which if you haven't heard of the IKEA effect, it basically tells us that we place up to 5 times the amount of value on something that we help build than something that we simply buy off the shelf, right? So there are a lot of people out there with poorly made futons and furniture, and they're never going to get rid of it because they made it themselves. So, like, what does this have anything to do with creativity or building things? I mean, we've kind of been told that innovation is a 2-step formula, right? You come up with a great idea and then you execute on it really well. And we always have debates on, is it the idea, is it the execution? But the fact is that there's a very key missing step in between. And this missing step is where we bring in early people, we bring in early team members, we bring in early investors, we bring in early partners, and we bring them in early enough so that they're able to crack an egg into the mix. And so that by the time we reach execution phase, they actually feel like it was their idea as well. They really felt like they were part of this whole thing. And, Pavel, I believe that you can trace every successful startup, every successful product initiative inside a big company, every successful political movement back to this hidden step.
There's a limit of what you can achieve alone, right? So that's why you.
Yeah, I mean, we know that, right? I mean, it's never just been one person with an idea. It was a group of people who felt like they were insiders of the idea.
Yep, totally agree. And then we see that also with our teams too. It's like, whenever you have an idea, maybe it's not complete yet, sharing it with our team, sharing it with our folks, and then that can actually spark a lot of new ideas, and that we iterate on and listen to, and we actually come out with a much better project or idea in the first place. So
yeah, because sometimes we walk into a room feeling like we need to have all the answers, right? And when we do that, what can happen is you can shut people out of the creative process. So it seems like you're trying to get them, in the IKEA terms, you're trying to get them to be a buyer instead of a builder. But especially when it comes to the early stages of new ideas, new things, new creations, and especially when you're trying to get people to buy in to something that isn't obvious, you got to make them into builders. They need to build with you in order to have that passion. And a big part of the reason for this, I mean, it may just sound good to say that you want to be inclusive, and it does sound good and it is important, but there's another key strategic reason that this matters, which is that when they leave the room, they're going to go out and they're going to try to convince other people as well, right? There's a great quote which says that like the majority of what happens in our lives happens when we're not even in the room, right? The majority of what matters happens when we're not even in the room. Decisions are being made, discussions are being had about us, but we're not there. And so the question is, those people, as they're having conversations about you or your idea, are they going to have founder level passion about you? Are they going to be really sort of advocating for you? And they're only going to do that. And there's a much higher likelihood that they're going to do that if they feel invested at a certain level in it too. And we get invested in the things where we feel like an insider.
Totally agree. And that actually reminds me of, I think it was the first chapter, convincing yourself first.
Yeah.
Right. And the throwaway work that I think you kind of, in the context of what we just talked about, is important, because you also need to be able to admit that you were wrong if you build something and it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So tell us more about your approach to that.
Yeah. So this is my first book, but I've wanted to be a writer for a long time. I went to law when I was in law school. I remember Salman Rushdie was passing through town. This was in Chicago, and I emailed him like 5 times asking if I could just grab some time with him. And finally he responded to one of my emails and said, "Hey, I'm going to be at this restaurant at this time. I'll show up a few minutes early if you want to meet me there." And so I did. And I only had a few minutes, so I cut right to the chase. And one of the first questions I asked him was, "How do you get inspired to write?" And I remember like the look on his face. It was like the last question he wanted to be asked, because he thinks it's not a great question. And he kind of rolled his eyes a little bit, and he said, "I don't get inspired to write. I just write. I sit down at my desk just like anybody else every day, and I work. I work hard, and I write." And he's like, "I write for about 8 hours a day, and the vast majority of what I write ends up going in the trash bin. It never gets used. But every day, if I'm diligent, there will be a small pearl. There'll be something in that pile that is usable. And my job as a writer is to string together those pearls. Those pearls end up making sentences, and eventually paragraphs, and eventually chapters, and eventually books. And that's my process." In other words, 99.9% of what he does never sees the light of day. And I think at that, I remember thinking to myself, like, that in a lot of ways is the process that I think all of us want to use for creativity, right? And we talk about sort of lean startup and sort of having lean agile methodologies. A lot of it is about throwaway work. A lot of it is about knowing that what you're building right now, you may put out into the market and get information from your customers or from whoever it is, your partners, that it actually is not working. And
it's a never-ending stream of experiments, and some work, some don't, right?
Some work and some don't. Lean goes off the rails. Agile goes off the rails when we get married to what it is that we're doing, right? In other words, we have fallen in love with the solution instead of the problem. But people who really, I think, adopt Agile in a very clear and compelling way have fallen in love with the problem and not the solution. They're putting things out there, and they're leaving themselves open to what's going to happen, and accepting the risk that what they have done may not actually be working, and therefore they need to throw away the work, and that's okay.
And it's especially hard for some of the engineers, whenever we work with startups too. It's like, you need to make sure that, first of all, you understand what you're building, but when you're building your MVP, for example, your digital product, and you have a feature to implement, it can take 2 weeks, but maybe it can take 1 day to implement, but it's going to be potentially a throwaway code.
Yeah.
And so that decision, whether chatting with your engineers, chatting about what's possible and what are the pros and cons of a throwaway solution. Just something that you should be considering, and that's also how we approach things when we build products.
Yeah. Right.
So maybe let's talk about the Earn Secret, the going beyond what is Googleable, and that surprising insight that you mentioned in your book.
Yeah, one of the people that I spent time with for the book was a guy named Brian Grazer, and Brian he's a Hollywood producer, but he's won like over 130 Emmys and dozens of Oscars, but he also invests in companies. He invests in startups. And so when I remember went to his waiting room, this is pre-COVID, and I was sitting in his waiting room in Beverly Hills, and there were like people there to pitch him on all sorts of different things. And you could just tell that the mood in the room was very anxious. People were very anxious. They were getting ready to meet with him. And so when I finally got called back to the conference room to meet with him, I said, Brian, you got this room full of really nervous people out there. If I could have given them one piece of advice before they came here today, one piece of advice to prepare for this meeting with you, what would it have been? And he thinks about it for a moment and he says, give me something that I can't easily find on Google. Give me something that is not easily Googleable. And I thought that was really interesting because as I talk to more and more decision makers, right, more and more people who are buyers or people who are making hiring decisions, what I found is that these backable moments, the great presentations, great pitches, great interviews, they tend to be based on an insight, some type of insight that you have personally gone out into the world and you have found. And you have found that through direct experience, right? You've put yourself into the world. And, you talked about how Ben Horowitz invested in Airbnb. One of the stories he will share is that Brian was actually renting out his own space, right? And that he was actually putting Craigslist out there, and he was coming into those meetings with the data around like how many people had actually, applied for that listing, right? Like he was actually putting himself into the story, and he was finding these insights. Leah Busky, when she founded TaskRabbit, she was actually cleaning homes. Logan Green was one of Lyft's first drivers. He was literally carting passengers around Los Angeles, and then he was taking notes. And those are the notes that he ended up bringing into his meeting when he was pitching Zimride, which ended up becoming Lyft. And so, it's this idea of like going beyond Google, right? Which, you don't necessarily always need to have an earth-shattering insight. I have found that that's, you want to have a twist on something that's out there, something that's at least slightly not obvious. But equally important is that you're actually putting yourself into the story. Like this is not something you found from behind a desk. You've gone out there and you've done something that probably most people wouldn't do. Like when I was starting my company Rise, I was standing outside of Weight Watchers meetings, right? I was literally, as customers are walking into Weight Watchers, I'd be like, hey, can I demo this prototype for you? And of course, most people said no, but some people said yes. And I initially thought that like that approach was going to be very unimpressive to investors, especially like Silicon Valley types. But it turned out to be the part of the pitch that they loved the most. Like they love that. They love that I was out there on the streets, like, trying to recruit and get my first customers. And that ended up creating the insights that they I think appreciated the most and motivated them to invest.
And I can imagine that sometimes, those insights can become your differentiator on the market, or provide some sort of defensibility too, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so I know community is really important to you, particularly now with your work with the Kingdom of Bhutan. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking that, Paweł, because it really actually really is, and like that's why I love doing things like this. I mean, Startup Grind has created this amazing community, and gosh, I mean, how important we always knew community was really important, and now I think we know that. Now I think every single one of us sort of believes it to our core. And a few years ago, I took a trip to the Kingdom of Bhutan, and Bhutan has always kind of been just really fascinating to me because they measure their progress in their country not based on gross domestic product, which is the way that most countries measure progress. They measure progress based on what they call gross national happiness. And they've been doing it this way for decades. And they believe that GDP and economic growth is very important, but it all rolls up into something higher. And then that's the happiness of their people. And so, it's really just truly an amazing sort of experience to be out there. And I had a chance to spend time with the research team. And the research team, they go out and they actually collect all the data around this happiness metric. And they have researchers from Oxford and Harvard and all over the world that help them with this. And I asked them, when you're going, community to community and you're talking to people, is there one question that you can ask, just one, that will give you a pretty good sense of how happy someone is? Pretty good indicator. And they said, yeah, as a matter of fact, there is. And the question is, if you were in real trouble today, who could you call and know with 100% certainty that person would be there for you? And they believe people who have an answer to that question are much more likely to be happy. But there's a twist.
Because they build meaningful relationships, I guess.
Yeah, but there's a twist. And the twist is, whose list are you on? Who can call you and know with 100% certainty you are going to be there for them? And they know that. They know they can call you, and they know you would be there for them. They believe that people who have an answer to that question have an even higher likelihood of being happy. In other words, it's not a line. It's not a transaction. It's a connection. It's a like you said, it's a real relationship. It's a circle that we're ultimately building. And that's why I think being part of, communities like this are just, it really means a lot to me. So, I just want to say thanks again for having me here.
Thank you, Suneel. It's been a pleasure to chat, and I think we have some time for questions from the audience. So thank you, Cassandra, can take over.
Happy to step in here. We've got a few. I'm sure we'll get some more as we start this. Let's see here, from an anonymous. For a young student, I'm still searching for what it is I'm exactly passionate about. What advice do you have for how I can find my passion or niche?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have 2 kids now. I have 2 daughters, and we do this little game. We started this game during the pandemic, and the game was that I'd say to them, this is right before they logged on to their Zoom school, I'd say, what is the meaning of life? And they would say, to find your gift. And then I'd say, well, what is the purpose of life? And they say, to give it away. It's one of my favorite quotes, Picasso, the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away. I think that sometimes, as I now think about how do I steer them, like how do I help them with that? Sometimes when we think about sort of gift or passion, we tend to think about it at, the LinkedIn level, which is kind of how are we going to present this to the outside world, right? What is it going to say? In other words, we tend to think about the noun more than we think about the verb, right? And the noun is I'm a doctor, but the verb is I want to be taking care of patients, right? I want to be spending my time taking care of patients. And, same thing with lawyer, same thing with programmer, same thing with everything. There's the noun and there's the verb. And the thing that I would say to you is that you really want to focus on that verb, right? Get beneath the title and really start thinking about like, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis, even an hour-to-hour basis, because that's how we're spending our time. And the satisfaction that we get from being able to put a title on a LinkedIn page is very temporary, right? But the time that we spend with the verb is literally endless. It consumes us. And so finding a way to get a little bit deeper, get beyond the noun, go into the verb, and really start thinking about the activities, the very, very specific activities that you tend to enjoy. There's a professor at Stanford, Jim Collins, who wrote a few great books, but wrote a book called Good to Great, and he's written a few others, who said that when he was trying to figure out his career, what he did is he literally kept a journal of every moment of his day. And so he'd go to every meeting and he'd write down how that meeting made him feel, right? And then he'd sort of get beneath that. Why did it make me feel that way? Well, it actually made me feel good. And part of the reason for that is because I got to get up to the whiteboard and I got to start drawing. Or that meeting made me feel miserable. Why was that? Because I didn't say a thing. There was somebody who just talked the whole time and I just didn't get a chance to speak, right? And he kept a very careful journal and log. And as a result of that, he was able to get way, way beyond the idea of like, I want to be an engineer, or I want to go do, he got down to the precise level. Here's how exactly I want to be spending my day. When he's spending hours doing this, and a few hours doing this, and a few hours doing that, and then taking those verbs and then figuring out the noun that was going to fit the best.
Yeah. In grad school, we called that getting to the essence. Cool. Asking 5 whys. So like, you like to do this. Why do you like to do that? Yeah. Why do you like that? So totally. Stephen asked, how do you introduce a quality story into a deck when you only have 12 or so slides and have to add the opportunity, the market, the team, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I don't, so you might be asking about both limited time and limited slides, right? And I think that limited slides, I don't think you need a lot in order to tell a story. In fact, I think more slides for a story can hurt you because it can kind of take away from, I think, the intimacy that you're trying to create. Now, ideally, this is a story that you've experienced. It could be your own, but it could be one that you've experienced. Look, let me tell you about so-and-so. I met this person this way. Here's what her day looked like, right? And I think it's okay to not have slides for that. That's the slide question. The time question is really interesting one, because I think that what I have found is that people tend to blow through that story very, very quickly, right? They tend to sort of just like want to move on. I actually think that it's really important to get it for a story to really hit. You want to get into some of the details. You actually do want to you actually want to take a little bit of time to let that story breathe. Now, I know that can feel uncomfortable, especially if you feel like you're sitting across from somebody who seems very busy, and you may have this temptation of like, let me just move on, right? But if you do that, then you don't really get the emotional pull of the story, and it loses its impact. So what I would say to you is take your time with that story. If you need to brush, so like if you need to move through the other parts of those slides, because they're always going to, like, chances are during Q&A, during the discussion part of the presentation pitch, they're going to go back to some of the other slides and tell me more about the market, tell me more about the product, but they're probably, the customer story though, they're probably not going to be like, well, tell me that detail again about that customer story. They're probably not going to go back to it. So it's your one chance to emotionally pull someone in. Stories really are what pull people in, and then substance is what keeps them there.
Sometimes people keep appendix slides at the end, so they don't use it during the pitch deck, but
that's right.
Whenever there's a Q&A afterwards, they can actually, maybe there's a specific question that wasn't in the pitch deck, but they have a slide that they can present further on. So
yeah. By the way, I was notoriously bad at that. I would have these super, super long pitch decks. And then, I'd have like 80% of the meeting would be like me talking, and then 20% would be discussion. And everything changed for me when I learned that like you should reverse that. It should be 20% up front, and then 80% of the time is to like really open it up to the creative possibilities that can come up inside the room.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit hard to let go where you feel like every detail is super important. So you need to have this behemoth of a deck.
Yeah.
And realizing that that it's not those little details that will sell your idea.
Totally.
We've got, first-time entrepreneur as a woman, first-time entrepreneur in a new to me space. How can I be sure I'm more fully prepared to be backable? It's in the cybersecurity, other than having a partner with an experienced co-founder in the space and having an impressive functioning prototype.
So much of being backable is about what do you do when the people across the table look different than you, right? I mean, because we know that there's bias, both conscious and unconscious, when it comes to backing people who look different than you. We tend to sort of gravitate or feel more confidence in people that look like us, and it just. So for those of us who are in the world right now trying to pitch people who don't, there's a bit of an upward climb, whether that's sort of, obvious or not. And one of the things I really enjoyed the most was watching, like being a fly on the wall during investment pitches and just watching how they worked. And one of the things that I saw, I remember there was a pizza shop owner outside of Brooklyn. And he had this just passion for making pizza. That's what he did. He was a fourth generation brick and mortar entrepreneur, but he came up with an idea to create an app that would allow you to push a button and get a pizza delivered. And this would be from a non sort of Domino's, non Little Caesars, from local mom and pop shops. And so I went to his investment pitch, and he was, I got there a little bit early, and I could tell that there was just a lot of passion behind what he did. Like, he was just very, he was passionate about pizza. And then as the investors started to walk into the room, you could see his demeanor really begin to change, because now I think he was sort of starting to play this role of like, how am I supposed to act now? Right? I've never done this before. I've never pitched venture capitalists. So, his slides go up on the screen, and now like he's kind of going through the classic PowerPoint slides. And again, his demeanor shifts. It's not nearly as energetic as it was before. But halfway through the presentation, he ends up pulling out his phone to show us the app itself, right? And the app, what he couldn't project it on the screen. So all of us sort of had to get up out of our seats, and we kind of all huddled around him. And as we were all huddled around him, the energy came back, because now we were all looking at this phone together, and he was showing us these interactions on his phone. And like, all of a sudden it was just, he was gregarious again. He was excited again. And that's all a long-winded way of saying to whomever asked this question that, like, oftentimes we want to shift whenever we're in a situation that's uncomfortable for us. We want to shift as quickly as possible from presentation mode into huddle mode, or we're actually looking at something together. And by the way, you mentioned you don't have a prototype. Your huddle mode doesn't necessarily have to be something polished or ready in that way. Huddle mode could literally be at a whiteboard. But as soon as possible, and again, I'd say this is important for everyone, but it's particularly important when the people in the room think different than you or look different than you, is you want to turn everybody's attention, including your own, to something that you can look at together. You want to start almost getting into a collaborative space with them sooner rather than later. And again, that means shifting from presentation mode into what I call huddle mode.
Tomas comments that, Suneel, you seem to have a lot of tenacity, for example, mailing Saman 5 times. Is this something that you've worked on, and how did you build that up?
Yeah, Tomas, good question. I guess I've had a little bit of it, but it's not because I'm not afraid to fail, right? That would be unfair. Like, I feel like I feel rejection just as much as anybody else. It hurts. It sucks. But I guess the thing that the mindset shift that I feel like I've had over the past 5 years is that I've stopped treating life as much like a to-do list, or I used to have like literally a list of all the stuff that I wanted to accomplish in my life. It was obnoxious. And I can still find that list somewhere. And I was definitely the person who, like, every January 1st walked into the year with a list. Then I have shifted my mindset from a to-do list to a to-learn list. So literally January 1st, I will write down the things that I want to learn. What do I actually want to learn? And for example, with this book, this is my first one. And I can guarantee you that if I walked in with the goal of, I want to write a best-selling book, I never would have written it. Because every day I would have been scared that what I was writing wasn't good enough. But my goal was, my to-learn list was, I want to be a better writer. I want to learn how to be a better writer. And I use this book as a way to learn how to do that, because it forced me to sit down and write every single day. It forced me to get feedback from writers that I respected. And so I think that the big shift, Tomas, has really been shifting from a to-do list to a to-learn list.
That's awesome. Okay, we have time for one more question before I hand it off for closing out. So we'll take this one from Daniel, who first of all says thank you. He's curious if you have resources or easy to access tools for entrepreneurs to help them become something more friendly to VCs. And if so, where could they find those?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's so many tools. There's so many tools out there. I have found, YC has like a video boot camp that I think is very useful. Pavel, I know you guys at Tooploox have pulled together a bunch of resources for entrepreneurs as well. Like you have those at your disposal, and you sort of talk to entrepreneurs about that. So maybe there's a way for you to share that. Obviously, I wrote this book because I felt like it filled a little bit of a gap, right? And the gap was, as an entrepreneur, oftentimes you're thinking about something new, right? And you're thinking about something creative, but we know that creativity and persuasion are two different things. They're two different skill sets. And the mistake that we make sometimes is we think about them as one, right? So if you don't have a good way of describing something, then we kind of assume sometimes, well, that's not a good idea, right? Or the flip side, sometimes somebody explains something very, very well, and we think, wow, that's a brilliant idea, when it actually isn't, right? So we know that creativity and persuasion are actually two different things, and that's where sort of my book comes in. But I think, Pavel, you'll have some good
Yeah,
research.
Daniel, please reach out to me, and after the event, we can circle back and kind of give you our best practices and resources we've got that we've collected over the years that may be helpful. So.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of our attendees and, of course, our panelists. I appreciate you for coming and dropping all this knowledge. We still have questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry to those that we weren't able to reach. And thanks again to AWS for sponsoring this. And Suneel, you're going to close us out?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this. I mean, like I said, community is so important to me, and it's a pleasure to be part of this community. I love to tell stories, and the story that I think that was just sort of the foundation of this book was about Damayanti Hingorani. And Damayanti Hingorani was a refugee on the border of Pakistan and India. She grew up with no running water, no electricity, and yet she did something remarkable. She taught herself how to read. And the first book that she read from cover to cover was the biography of Henry Ford. And so after reading this book, she decides that she wants to become an engineer with Ford Motor Company. And she literally, her parents get behind the dream, they get behind the vision, they save every penny they have to get her on a boat. She gets a scholarship to Oklahoma State University. And the day after she graduates, she drives to Detroit, Michigan to apply for her dream job. And she manages to get herself into a room with a hiring manager. And this hiring manager looks at her resume, and he looks at her application, and he says, wait a second, are you applying for the job of an engineer? And she says, yeah. And he says, well, I'm sorry, we actually don't have any female engineers working here right now. Because see, this was the 1960s. And while Ford Motor Company had thousands of engineers on staff, not a single one of them was a woman. And so Damayanti Hingorani, deflated in this moment, she picks up her resume, picks up her purse, and she begins to walk out of the room. And then almost in this last ditch moment, she summons all of the courage she can. She turns around, she looks this guy in the eyes, and she tells him her story of all the struggle that it took for her to get to this country, for her to get to Detroit, to get to this very room. And then she says to him, look, things are changing. And if you don't have any female engineers on staff, then do yourself a favor and hire me now. And this hiring manager is so moved in this meeting that he decides to leave that space, and he goes out and he fights with his colleagues. He fights with his supervisors. He advocates for her. And in 1967, she becomes Ford Motor Company's first female engineer. And I love that story because it inspired so many people. Time magazine wrote a big article on her as a trailblazer. It inspired immigrants, inspired women in the workforce, and it also inspired me because Damayanti Hingorani is my mom. And if a middle manager from suburban Michigan had not taken a chance on a refugee from the other side of the world, then I wouldn't be here with you right now. So the thing that I would leave you with is, as we go out into the world today, let's work on making ourselves backable, but let's also find good people and let's help them become backable. Because sometimes the easiest and best way to change the world is to take a chance on someone else. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suneel. Very inspiring.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great week, everyone. Thank you, everyone. And be safe. Be good to others. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.